Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Policy Wall with ORF Middle East. My name is Mahdi Ghuloom, and I'm a junior fellow here in the Geopolitics vertical. Today's guest with me is Dr. Robert Mogielnicki, a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington and adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown University. He's a leading expert on Gulf political economies, focusing on economic diversification, trade, and technology, and he heads AGSI's China Gulf Initiative. Robert holds a doctorate from Oxford, has written widely on Gulf development and investment, and brings both academic and policy insight to understanding the region's transformations. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So our topic today will be tax transformations in the Gulf, Doctor. And I'd like to ask you, just to set the scene here. So the Gulf's fiscal landscape has changed a lot in the past few years. What do you think is driving this new wave of tax policy from VAT to corporate income taxes?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. Look, I think the obvious explanation here is that new and higher taxes are the easiest way to increase non-oil revenue streams. It's the easiest way. It's kind of the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, although it's not all super low and it's not always easy, but It is in the broad kind of economic policy domain. I would say it's the low-hanging fruit of ways to achieve steady progress on economic diversification. And I think if we think about the value-added tax story in Saudi Arabia, this is a perfect example. I mean, the Saudis boosted their value-added tax from 5% to 15%. That had a big impact on, total non-oil revenue streams flowing into the, into state coffers. So I'd say it's being able to make quick and relatively tangible progress on economic diversification, and in particular, the diversification of fiscal revenues. That's where I see the main objective being. Now, of course, there are other reasons to pursue tax reform, and I think we'll get into those later.
Thank you. One of the perspectives that coming from Bahrain, we have faced a lot is whether this tests kind of the social contract in the Gulf nations, and in particular, I think the widely held view is that the Gulf is slow in rolling out taxes because of being worried about facing domestic resistance to those policies, about shaking up the social contract. How valid do you think that view is? Is there a real threat of negative domestic perception towards these taxes, or is that overstated?
I'd say a two-part answer to your question.
Okay.
I think that the social contract and the sensitivities around taxes explain why taxes have remained relatively low in the region.
Okay.
Why they have been slow to materialize and to be, essentially to be implemented, and also why we see uneven implementation and a lot of carve-outs and exemptions. So I think it explains one side of this debate. I am more hesitant to use the social contract as an explanation for what will happen when we see new taxes.
Okay.
And we've started to see some reports and analyses come out, especially around the announcement of Oman's personal income tax, which is slated for the future. That this could really shake up the social contract in the country, and this could result in a major paradigm shift. And I'm less confident that that's going to happen. So I think the social contract dimension is more useful for explaining what has happened in the past and maybe the dynamics that are going on now. This continuation of slow and steady progress on taxes, but with plenty of exemptions, plenty of carve-outs. Not so much in terms of really upending paradigms going forward. I think the governments are going to be very, very careful for that not to happen. And there's a lot of incentives on both ends for there not to be a radical reconfiguration or upending of the social contracts that exist today. But you're Bahraini. What do you think about this?
I think you're right. There are divergent policies in the Gulf and threat perceptions of to what extent tax rollout is going to materialize in anti-government sentiment. To be frank, in Bahrain with the history, especially in 2011 and what followed, I think that threat perception is higher, and we've seen, for example, in Bahrain. A reform package that struggled and still hasn't gone through parliament to really kind of boost fiscal reforms. Partly because parliament were worried about trust in parliamentary institutions if they were to give approval to this kind of reform package that really would affect people's disposable income. So I think as you're right to point out, it really differs from country to country. I think with nations that have faced such upheavals in the past, namely kind of Bahrain, partly Saudi Arabia, those threat perceptions are perhaps not as inflated as and more valid than other threat perceptions across the Gulf. But you mentioned Oman, and I really want to zoom in on Oman here.
Sure.
And the personal income tax. And I completely agree with you. I think people are really exaggerating how much this would shake up the social contract. But do you think this is because of details in the personal income tax? Or is it, I've heard a statistic that says, only 1% of the population would be affected. Now, is that why you think the social contract wouldn't be upended, or are there other reasons that lead you to that conclusion?
Well, I think for a couple of different reasons. One, it appears, based on our knowledge at this point about how this law will unfold, or the law around the personal income tax, how that will actually translate on the ground when it's implemented in the future. It's going to apply, as you said, to a very small percentage of citizens. Mm-hmm. So your kind of rank and file Omani citizens, it appears, are not going to be impacted by this law. Actually, contrary to that, I think part and parcel of the government efforts in putting this law forward, but applying it only to a very small percentage of the demographics, the upper kind of echelons of higher net worth individuals, in some ways may be geared. I mean, I'm not saying this with any huge degree of certainty, but just based on kind of my assessment of Oman and the economic landscape, it may very much be geared to address some longstanding concerns about inequality in the country. I mean, I think Oman is not the only country that where you have very wealthy individuals, and also a larger population of citizens who are middle class Omani citizens, and those of lower socioeconomic means. And I think in the past we have seen some examples that the broader group of Omani citizens have, they are concerned about the cost of living, about having stable jobs and well-paying jobs. And I think the government, this is one of the ways, and there are many other ways too, that the government is responding to those concerns. I think you could look at it in this light. If you're an Omani, you say, okay, well, at least now if if there is a personal income tax, those who have been able to, to become very wealthy and to succeed economically and commercially in our country are going to be expected to, to contribute back in some form through this personal income tax. So I think that's one way that you could look at this. Zooming out beyond Oman, mm-hmm. I think the trend in the region is that we're going to see more taxes. Mm. I say this a lot to a range of different kind of investors and multinational companies who are looking at the region and wondering where taxes are heading.
Right.
I think the broad trend is more taxes. That means new tax regimes and higher taxes. Okay. But that's going to happen in a very piecemeal fashion.
Okay.
It's not going to be uniform across the region. It's going to be very uneven, and and there will be plenty of exemptions and carve-outs. So a good example of this, Saudi Arabia, we know that they're really interested in attracting multinational firms to set up their headquarters in their country. we know that there's a lot of room to maneuver in
Right.
terms of the arrangements that the deals that they can strike with the Saudi government if they're willing to kind of align company goals with government objectives in Saudi Arabia. And I think taxes is one of these areas where there's some room to maneuver. You can get tax exemptions, you can get deferrals, and the like. So it's an area that, as I said, the trend line is upward, but it's still a lot of room for negotiation.
Right. And, playing devil's advocate here,
Sure.
with Saudi Arabia being the exception, I think one uniform policy that has shaped up across the Gulf recently is this kind of domestic minimum top-up tax under the OECD.
The corporate income tax, yeah.
And I think partly, my opinion is that this is due to the external pressures that kind of have situated the Gulf in an impossible position of either giving away tax revenue to competing economies, or just biting the bullet and implementing the tax domestically. So do you think kind of these kind of external pressures could lead to more uniform tax policies across the Gulf, or are these kind of external pressures even likely?
Yeah, it's a tough position, but I guess the way we've seen the governments react to this pressure demonstrates it's not an impossible position. They've been able to navigate. These pressures, I would say, relatively well. Some of the countries like the UAE kind of jumped the gun, if I remember correctly, with a corporate income tax that was lower than the initial threshold. I think 9%. I'm not sure where it stands now, if it's kind of harmonized or not. But basically, jumped the gun, got on board in theory.
Yes.
But then kind of instituted a rate that was still very, very competitive.
I think it was about 9%.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, I think that's kind of the strategy here for other Gulf governments. So that's the playbook.
Yeah.
These governments don't want to be perceived as being the holdouts, the global holdouts, or the global exceptions. They certainly are concerned about being on various kind of gray lists, and they want to uphold global standards when it comes to being hubs for investors and for finance hubs, and that comes with accepting certain norms and standards.
Right.
And that's why I think there was willingness to manage these global pressures, and they came at a time when global pressures, especially from the U.S. and from Europe a couple of years ago, were a very different tenor than they are now. So. Right. They adapted, and we saw the corporate minimum income tax coming online, but still at a very competitive global rate. So, yes, it kind of fits with the thesis that I put out there that we're going to see more taxes, but they're still going to be, in the global landscape, relatively competitive ones.
Okay.
It's the Gulf is still a low tax landscape, and it's still competitive. For people worried about tax exposure and tax obligations, this is still a very competitive place to be.
Thanks for that. And I have just two final questions. And I think the thing that really kind of is prominent in my mind right now is, do you think taxes are going to be part of the future visions of the Gulf? Bahrain is now studying a Vision 2050. I suspect other Gulf countries will soon follow suit and producing, Vision 2060 or 2065 or 2055. With minimal divergence in terms of the dates. But is there a prospect for elevating a national consensus or towards a tax policy in a long-term vision, or you still think that that's potentially unlikely?
Well, they're going to be part of the vision, but the question is, how are they going to be part of the vision? And I think they're going to indirectly play an important role in these visions.
Right.
That really depends on two different things, or two different ways of thinking about the visions. These visions, of course, have a domestic audience. And they also have an external audience.
Right.
And the way the visions are marketed to the domestic audience and the reasons for that marketing are different than their marketing to an external audience.
Yes.
So no matter where you are, if you're in the Gulf or in the U.S., people just universally hate taxes. I think we're born with that, inherently born with that. I don't know if it's right all the time to feel that way.
Right.
It probably isn't. But I mean, so it doesn't make for great promotional...
The ethics of taxation.
The ethics of taxation. It doesn't make for great promotional material. So I don't expect that, the brochure, so to speak, for Vision 2030 is handed out to global investors coming to FII next year or in the future will, very prominently feature, here's what's likely to happen on the tax regime front going forward.
Right.
It's not going to be... it's not going to be prominently featured in that respect.
Like you said, it's mostly going to focus on exemptions. And
it will talk about, the ways, I guess, the different types of exemptions and incentives you can get.
Right.
But here's how it's indirectly important. Gulf officials know that in order to actually increase non-oil revenue streams in a sustainable way, you've got to grow your economies.
Right.
So there's a limit to how many taxes you can, new taxes you can impose, how high those tax rates can be before that policy starts to run out of steam and starts to become unsustainable. So they know that actually, in order to grow those non-oil income streams through taxation, the more sustainable route is to grow your economy. And this is precisely what we've heard from the Minister of Finance, the Saudi Minister of Finance, who visited Washington for the IMF and World Bank meetings this fall. He said, I'm paraphrasing here, and it was a public event, but if I remember correctly, he said, we're not going to increase the tax burden at this time. We feel that it's high enough for the moment. What we want to do is grow our economy. And in that way, we can generate, more value, whether it's from taxes and otherwise, from a larger economy. So you cut a slice of a larger pie. Right. And that is really where I see the visions playing a prominent role and taxes playing an indirect role. Okay. The visions are about growing their economy, by and large. There are other parts of the vision too, but growing economies by promoting strategic sectors and giving a roadmap about where and how these governments are going to do that. Now, could there be some room in the social dimensions of the visions as they're marketed toward a domestic audience about, hey, governments, we the government expect our citizens to play more a role in the future development of this country, to play a role in the sustainable development of our countries. And part of that is going to, be slight shifts in your kind of obligations as citizens, be they economic or otherwise. Maybe there's some room there to convey some messages. But as I said before, given the kind of universal hatred of taxes, I think direct mentions to taxes will probably be avoided, but the general theme, I imagine, would be in there.
I've really taken a lot of your time, but I'll end with this final question.
Sure.
We tend, when we think of taxes, we tend to focus in the Gulf on how the citizens perceive it or as individuals. Mm-hmm. But I think increasingly as the business community enlarges and as well as established family companies expand and grow, there's an increasing question of corporate income tax on local businesses. And from my distant observation on the tax regimes, I'm really learning a lot here. I see that there's a differential treatment of foreign investors and local businesses. Meanwhile, that's kind of balanced with portraying the Gulf as open to, most economies to 100% foreign ownership and attracting foreign investors. How do you see this dynamic kind of changing in the future? Will there be a consistent emphasis on kind of taxing foreign investors while also trying to attract them? Or will kind of local businesses be expected to play more of a role in eventually expanding the tax base and including them in it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. When I wrote a piece for this on personal income tax when we heard the kind of formal announcement of the Omani personal income tax. Right. Of course, we'd been hearing some whispers about it for some time, but when it was formally announced and put in place, or a future date put in place, I wrote this piece, and as part of my preparations and research, I spoke to a number of other folks in other countries too, saying, well, testing out this idea. Well, what do you think about personal income tax? And say in Saudi Arabia, and the view I got back is no, not really on the not on the table anytime soon. But there was some willingness for locals to say, well, I mean, for citizens, no, but we could potentially see there being a personal income tax on non-Saudis.
Right.
Now, I'm not saying that this is not to indicate that this is likely to happen. I'm just saying there was a greater willingness amongst some local citizens to say, well, we don't see it coming online for us, but maybe there would be some consideration within the government about how to potentially tax others in this way. This gets to your point about the difference between locals and foreigners, whether it's in terms of investors, high net worth individuals, or companies.
Right.
I think the reality is, and Gulf governments know this, that ultimately investors have to be treated equally, whether they are local or foreign. Right. That is the ideal to work toward. It's going to be difficult to get there, and it's not going to be perfect, but that's the ideal to shoot for, and that's what's going to. It's going to be an important part of making strides as investment hubs, global investment hubs, and we started to see some movement on that front. The Saudi government has reformed and updated its investment law, and it appears that they've made some strides leveling the playing field between domestic and foreign investors. Okay. Alongside a number of other policy moves that have also kind of reduced curbs on foreign ownership and limits on foreign investment in certain Saudi companies. So they are making moves in that direction because I think they rightfully understand that foreign investors do not want to set up in a location where they feel they're going to be treated very differently and at a disadvantage from local, from local counterparts and competitors.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I just want to end with a remark here. I think as we speak, yesterday on November 5th, the Crown Prince and Prime Minister of Bahrain announced the launch of an international commerce court in Bahrain, and presented a very interesting speech about in the King Hamad Lecture for Justice, which was inaugurated, and he said, the rule of law I'm paraphrasing here, the rule of law is crucial for investment, and trust in the rule of law is crucial for foreign investors and trade and other aspects of the economy. And I couldn't agree more. And I think this is a growing emphasis in the Gulf that, even if the policies may be differentiated, the investors shouldn't feel that there are indirect differential treatments. That should be transparent and clear, and as much as possible to actually level the playing field as Saudi Arabia has done, and I'm sure Bahrain is doing. Transparent
and clear, and also telegraphed. So giving investors, a good sense of what they can expect in the future, as much as government authorities knows. And this maybe gets back to your point about what room is there for a greater conversation about taxes. It doesn't all have to be negative. That actually, investors, they prize clarity over uncertainty. And even the worst thing than bad news is is not knowing that you have There's a better
clarity allows you to mitigate.
There's a better saying that I can't recall at the moment, but yes, the sense is I'd rather have bad news and know about it than not know and be surprised later. And I think that is an area where one could see there being more room to have a very frank and open discussion about taxes, tax regimes, and where they're headed. Because that ultimately is going to give investors and multinationals, whether they're foreign or, local companies, a lot more, trust in the government. And trust that they can, that they can continue to engage in the business environment and be successful players in the economy.
Well, with that, we'll conclude. And thank you so much, Dr. Robert Mogielnicki from AGSI. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you
so
for
much.
having me.
Take care.
Pleasure.